Good afternoon, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens' weekly webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens. I want to do a bit of housekeeping to let you know what to be able to do to make this optimal viewing for you today. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Education and Collections Manager at Smithsonian Gardens. So we're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat box, and then after the presentation, we'll come back and I will ask the presenters the questions. And all the questions will be answered either in this video or this webinar, or we will post the questions and answers on our website for those that don't get answered during the session. Also, for optimal viewing conditions, we ask you to close all other browsers so that only this one is open. And then that way you should have the best viewing conditions possible. And today is the last of our summer series. I can't believe our summer is almost over. So we're going to go on hiatus for 2 weeks, but then join us on September 24th because we're going to start a fall series. And we have all kinds of great webinars, subjects to teach you about gardening and to share the information that we've learned as horticulturists throughout the years. So I invite you to go back on our website and at gardens.si.edu and join us for signing up for our fall series. And we'll have that up next week so that you'll be able to just start signing up for your favorite topics that you want to hear about. Also, I want to invite you to come downtown. If you're in the DC area, our gardens are open. And if you need a beautiful place to sit and relax and stay away from a lot of people because we are social distancing in our gardens, it's a perfect time to come down and enjoy a little bit cooler weather than we've had during the month of July and August. I'm looking forward to this cooler fall coming up. So today's presentation is going to help you understand when your plant is calling for help. A plant will show different conditions, different signals that will give you clues as to what may be wrong with them. Why are they not growing optimally? And we did this as a video. We pre-recorded it. And I do have the two presenters here with me today, Debra Austin and Virginia Thaxton. Debra and Virginia both work at our greenhouse facility in Suitland, Maryland. And they're going to come back on after the video is presented and answer all the different questions. So we're going to disappear here for a couple minutes, and then we'll be back to be able to answer your questions that you have after viewing the video. Here we go.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's Let's Talk Gardens webinar. I'm Virginia Thaxton. My coworker Debra will be joining us in the second half of the talk. We are talking about understanding plant stress signals, abiotic factors. Our talk is going to include an introduction to plant stress. Then the abiotic factors we're going to cover are water, temperature, light, and nutrients. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to mention or show and explain how the symptoms present themselves for a particular factor. And then we're going to mention how to avoid or correct them when possible. In a biological context, stress in a plant refers to external conditions that adversely affect growth, development, or productivity of the plant. It could also be defined as a significant deviation of the optimal condition of life. Plant stress can be divided into two primary categories, the abiotic stress and biotic stress. Abiotic stress is imposed on plants by the environment in which they're in, which may be either a physical or chemical stress. Biotic stress, on the other hand, is caused by a biological unit, like diseases caused by bacteria or fungi, or the insects that cause pests in our plants. Plants respond to the environmental stresses at multiple physiological levels. It's a very, very complex response. We're going to see responses at a molecular level, cellular level, at the tissue level, anatomical, morphological, or a whole plant level. These responses are going to vary depending on a species and cultivar. They're never going to be exactly the same, even though there's an underlying science base for them. The plant response to stress is going to also depend on the duration and severity of the event, as well as the age and developmental stage of the plant. when the stress is imposed. A concept that I want to mention before we go on is that a signal is an observable change in a quality. It gives us information about what we're observing and what's changing. In the case of plants, we can observe symptoms that are displayed in response to an environmental change or stimuli. The different symptoms that a plant shows or displays in response to the environment are their way of signaling to us they're under stress. It's like yelling, help. So the first factor is water. Water is an essential element necessary in most fundamental processes of plant growth, as it is for every other living thing. Water stress can occur by lack of water, which we call drought, or by root impairment, which is due to lack of oxygen from too much water. It's the two opposite ends. Both the drought stress that comes from underwatering or the waterlogging that comes from overwatering are common causes of plant losses. Unfortunately for us humans, the signals that come from over or underwater plants are similar. Many times we're going to see the same outcome, sick and dead plants. One example of this is wilting, one of the major symptoms that we see when water stress is present. Wilting is a sign both of too much or too little water. Not only that, wilting can be caused by too much sun, being root bound, too much fertilizer, and some diseases too. This leads us to saying diagnostics of plant stress symptoms can take some detective work and also very careful observing of your plants. We're going to talk more about that later. Water stress can cause many invisible processes to be affected. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the science behind this. The fact that wilting is a symptom comes from the loss of turgor pressure. This word you see here. That means that when a cell is full of water, it's completely tight in there and the plant is its normal self. But when there's lack of water that the plant cannot uptake from the roots, then there's no force in the cell begins to collapse. Water leaves the cell and the cell collapses. That gives the plant the limp appearance that we see when something is wilting. As wilting increases and progresses, all the plant cells are going to fully deflate. The cell will lose its structural integrity, and this causes death because only fully full of water cells are going to be healthy. Photosynthesis and all other processes that keep a plant alive and allow it to produce its food and grow are going to slow down and stop if there's not enough water. Water is required to keep the cells alive. When a plant is under water stress, the roots are just not taking enough water, either because there's no water in the soil or because there's too much and the roots are not taking up oxygen and breathing, so they die. When this happens, the roots are going to send a signal to the leaves to close the stomata. I'm going to show you the stomata right down here. The stomata are the little openings in a plant leaf that are going to allow the plant to exchange. Intake CO2 and release oxygen, to exchange gases, and also to transpire. So when there's not enough water in the soil, the plant gets a signal, close the stomata. When there is enough water, these cells are totally full of water and the opening is there. When there's no water, the guard cells are gonna shrink, and then the stomata closes. When that happens, basically all water transport in the plant stops. When the water movement stops, then there's no nutrients that are going to different parts of the plant. Photosynthesis stops, growth, cell expansion, respiration. The plant runs out of energy. All because there's not enough water to keep its gas exchange and water transport going. So when it comes to water stress, we have the overwatering at one extreme and then underwatering. The overwatering symptoms, the plant begins to drop leaves, both new and old. The leaves may become limp, soft, yellow, they appear rotten. And one thing that happens is the plant is going to develop soft roots. They rot sometimes. And the root system is basically drowning. There's not enough oxygen in the soil when it's waterlogged. In these pictures, we see an example of a golden pothos where the plant is healthy. You can see the root ball is basically the size of a 6-inch pot. The leaves are fine, completely green and standing straight. When you see waterlogging effects, the roots die. This one is a little bit soft, even though it's hard to tell in this picture. You see yellow leaves, you see leaves that are curled, limping. This is an effect of overwatering. When this happens to the roots, then you see fungal diseases come in. The root rot is going to cause the roots to turn gray, brown, slimy, and the plant eventually is just going to wilt. There's not enough water being transported to the leaves. Other symptoms we can see with overwatering are mildew, mold, or fungal growth on the soil or the plant or the pot around the plant. One common one is called the flower pot parasol. They're like little umbrellas. They grow when the media stays too moist, too wet. This particular fungus is not going to cause a disease to the plant. It's just an indication letting us know that the soil is too wet. Some plants are not going to mind. In this case, this pot has a staghorn fern, so it's not going to really be that affected, but it's just good to know. It's a good indication that if we're watering too much, and a lot of plants are not going to like that. So it lets us know it's a symptom that is helpful. In other cases, we see the base of the stem get mushy, rotten odors that emanate from the potting soil. All of those are indications that you have too much water. Also, if the plant looks wilted, but you touch the soil and it's wet, there's overwatering. You can always take it out of the pot if it's a containerized plant and check the roots to see what their health status is. How to prevent overwatering? Most plants with regular water needs, you need to only water when the soil is dry to the touch. Now, there are exceptions, plants that love constant moisture, like aquatic plants or desert and succulent plants, which are gonna wanna dry out between waterings. You can always check this by just placing a finger an inch or two into the soil. Most plants don't require watering if that first couple of inches are moist still. But there's also moisture meters and testers and water content measuring devices, a lot of different things that can be purchased if you want to be a little bit more scientific about it. But the finger definitely works. Lastly, for preventing overwatering, if you have container plants that you're watering that have a drip tray or drain plate, never leave standing water in them after you have irrigated them. Just make sure you empty that water. For underwatering symptoms, we get to see the plant slows down its growth. It's going to have brown leaves, dry leaf edges. It drops the leaves or flowers if it's already blooming. It may fail to flower completely. The lower leaves are usually suffering first. They're going to curl up, get crispy, yellowed. And ultimately, when severe water deficit is experienced, the plant is going to completely dry up, wilt, and die. We have a couple of examples here where you see the well-watered plant and the wilting plant, totally limp leaves or dry out and curled up. Underwatering prevention. Oh, I am sorry about this, you guys. You can check your soil moisture frequently. That happens for over or underwatering. It's good and important to always be checking your plants. Do they look too dry? Do they look too wet? The same as with overwatering, the first top 2 inches of the soil should never dry out completely if the plant is not a desert plant or a succulent. But also addition of mulch helps to keep soil moisture. Even if you have indoor plants, you could do artificial top dressing mulches that help maintain the soil moisture. The second factor I'm going to cover is temperature. Temperature stress has very devastating effects on plant growth and metabolism. And this comes from a very famous plant physiology graph where you have temperature versus a response. In this case, we have growth rate, enzyme activity, photosynthesis, anything you can think about in the metabolism of the plant is going to be affected by temperature. And it usually tends to have a bell curve like this. So there's this one center range of temperatures that is going to be optimal. Why? Because all those processes have countless numbers of biochemical reactions, and all of them are very sensitive to temperature. So if the plant is not performing in that range, all of these processes stop. Temperature has an effect because it affects the cell membranes, and all these processes have cell membranes involved in them. Cell membranes are going to be affected by cold-driven rigidification or heat-driven fluidization. This is a regular structure of a cell membrane. It has 2 layers of phospholipids and a lot of proteins embedded in them. This is what makes them functional. The proteins allow things in and out of the cell. And when it gets either too rigid or too fluid, it stops acting normal. The proteins in the membrane get deactivated, and then the plant doesn't get enough food, and there's leakage of ions, potassium, sodium, chlorine. Once they come in and out of the cell, then what's called the homeostasis, the balance, gets totally lost. So the cell is not functioning correctly. The reason photosynthesis is affected by temperature is, and I want to show you this diagram just briefly, photosynthesis happens in a cell membrane, just like the one we were seeing before. The whole photosynthetic apparatus is composed of proteins inside a phospholipid bilayer. These ones that are green are the ones that have the chlorophyll, and the whole process happens here. They absorb the light, and then they transfer electrons and produce food. So increased temperatures can cause chemical alterations to all the photosynthetic pigments that are in these proteins, and low temperatures can create an imbalance in all that electron transport. So photosynthesis is affected because everything happens in a membrane in the chloroplast. That's the connection to why temperature affects photosynthesis. So the other side of temperature is, the other extreme is heat. Heat stress can occur from high daytime temperatures, high nighttime temperatures, or high soil temperatures. For houseplants, also close proximity to indoor heat sources. The intensity of heat, duration of exposure, and the rate of increase in the temperature is going to affect the response, like it happens with most factors. The most obvious symptom is when you see persistent afternoon wilting, even though there's adequate soil moisture. Then you're going to get some foliage burn. You can get, from hot air injury, browning of the tips in all the older leaves edges. Then also the new tip growth can wilt and die back. If there is a prolonged heat exposure, it's possible to see growth reduce, leaf drop, leaf scald, failure to flower, failure to produce seeds. Heat is not a good thing for plants. When you get extreme heat, and in these examples, we use a heater, like a space heater, and you get rapid moisture loss in extreme heat, and it can cause tender leaves to turn black, like we see here in this Dracaena. Basically, all the cell walls and all the cells lose their water and die, and the tissue loses its color and its structure. Same with the Stratoscantia, and this one also dries up completely and loses all the turgor of the leaves, and then you see them flapping like this. Heat prevention. Irrigation is a must in order to maintain plant health during hot and dry conditions. Also, proper watering year-round promotes deep root systems that are going to keep the plant healthier. The healthier it is, the more it can withstand summer heat. Container plants are going to require daily watering in high temperatures, so make sure you water them very through, and drainage holes are showing water coming out of them. In addition to watering more often, you can mulch the plants. Mulch serves the purpose of helping keep plants warm, but also cold or cooler, and then prevents water loss. Moving potted plants to a shadier location during the heat of the day is recommended if possible, or just originally placing them in a place where they don't get that much sun. Or the use of shade covers, that might be helpful as well. Cold symptoms. So what happens here, again, relates to cell membranes. When water freezes, it's gonna cut the membranes, all the sharp ice crystals that get formed there. This is going to disrupt the membranes, they're going to stop working. So fluids leak from the cell, and the cells and the whole plant die. One of the first symptoms you're going to see is the drooping of the leaves, discoloration. As you see in this neon pothos, totally lost its bright, nice green color. It's dull and black and wilting. Plants may also show wilting, reduced leaf expansion, surface lesions, chlorosis, necrosis, desiccation, tissue breakdown, water soak appearance of tissues. There's a lot of potential symptoms for cold exposure. In this Stratoscantia, you can see here the water soaked tissue, and they lose coloration too. It's not as bright and vibrant as here. And in this Dracaena, also darker color green, and these are necrotic lesions on the leaves. This is just after exposing the plant for a few days to not even freezing temperatures, but temperatures close to 32. And that's one terminology that I wanted to introduce here is chilling injury. Not every plant gets damaged from complete freezing. Some plants, especially tropical plants, are going to be chilling sensitive, meaning temperatures between 32 and 55 degrees can cause all these cold symptoms. And what happens is, why do they show water stress symptoms? Why do they wilt? Why do they curl like that? Is because when it gets cold, the conductivity of water across the plant gets affected. And this is another drawing where I just briefly wanted to mention to you that basically the piping system of the plant, the xylem and the phloem that move water and move the nutrients and the food, they are conformed by cells that are interconnected. And cells get affected by temperature, then their ability to transport water or nutrients is going to be affected too. How do we prevent cold? Well, mulching again. Mulching not only helps to retain water and keep plants cooler, but also warmer. The planting location is more important. When you first choose a location for your plant, try to put it in full sun if it can take it. Areas that retain heat, like under the canopy of trees or near a corner of the outside of the house. Tropical plants need to overwinter indoors. They're way too sensitive for extremely cold temperatures in places where the winter is cold enough for that. Covering your plants helps protect plants from the severe cold. You can use anything from commercial cloths, like we see in this picture, some small nursery plants being covered, but also at home you can use an inverted plastic pot or old sheets to put above them when the temperature is going to be below freezing. The last factor I'm going to cover is light. It's another very important environmental factor. It plays a critical function in plant development and metabolism. All those same processes that get affected by water deficit or temperature are going to be affected by light. The plant needs sunlight to drive photosynthesis, and this process allows them, as we know, to collect solar energy, CO2, and produce sugar molecules, which make the plant grow. Different plant types are going to require very different light intensities. So when we purchase a plant, we always need to find out a lot about it, like how much water does it want, how much light does it want. So light is a good thing for plants, but neither too much nor too little is going to help us. Too much sunlight can be detrimental to plants. They cause damage to their leaves from the UV rays, and they obviously cause dehydration from rapid evapotranspiration. There's too much sunlight, there's heat produced around the leaf, and then the gas exchange and the transpiration get to increase. When there's too little light, then we just don't have photosynthesis going on, because photosynthesis is driven by light. Other physiological processes also get affected, like the gas exchange, the water transport, the pigment synthesis. They all need light to occur. For high radiation symptoms, we get, as you see in this picture, white, yellow, tan burns, like this also. They're very familiar response to intense sunlight. Now, plants can also wilt due to rapid evapotranspiration. I don't have a picture of that for here, but the sunburns are the most key indication that you have the plant in too much sun. So what happens is they get damaged because plants have an epidermis layer, just like our skin. So they basically are getting sunburn the way we do from UV rays. In this drawing, we have what a leaf looks like. And this thin layer at the top is what will be our skin. Right beneath it, you see all the cells with the chloroplast and the chlorophyll, and those are the ones that are going to absorb light and produce food. What happens is if they are too intense, the UV rays, this whole layer is going to have cells dying, and then the light gets here and damages all our chloroplasts. Plants have a defense against this. They can produce non-green pigments that can act as antioxidants. They're like a sunscreen. So that's what you see sometimes when plants have colorations of red and oranges, not only fall colors, but at other times they are protecting their chloroplast from the sun. So to prevent from high radiation, we need to keep plants well watered, very well watered, especially during the summer months. Sensitive plants exposure to intense sunlight should be avoided though. You choose a sheltered location from full sun. If you know your plant well, you know if you cannot take it, then just don't put it out in the sun. You can keep in mind that reflected light from walls and other surfaces can increase radiation, so that should come into consideration when choosing a location. There's no cure for a sunburn injury, but the plant can be moved away from the sun, and if you let it rest and water it and feed it, then eventually after the new leaves get produced, you can cut off the dead ones. The last thing to mention here is you need to harden off your seedlings or small plants in the early spring when you're putting things out in the garden, because that way they acclimate to being exposed to a full day of bright sunlight. Hardening off is defined as the slow and gradual acclimation of a specific environmental condition. It could be for cold or high radiation or other things. Low radiation, on the other hand, it has a negative effect because then there's not enough light to carry on photosynthesis and produce the food that the plant needs to grow. So there's a decrease in plant biomass, meaning all the weight of material that the plant produces. And there's very little flowering performance if there's not enough light. Even when the growth slows down though, one of the effects we see, as this picture shows, is that the plant stretches. The internodes, which is the distance between two sets of leaves, is going to be longer. In this picture, we have the same Tradescantia plant, but this one was grown in the light. This one was grown in lower radiation, but I moved them and planted them side by side so you could see how stretched they are. We don't want a plant that looks like this. So it's important for a plant to have enough light. The stretching comes from too much infrared light when the light is low. And that means the plant is trying to stretch to find the light. There's a signal that tells it, hey, stretch, stretch, find the light. And it's just gonna look floppy like this. You can also expect thin leaves, small leaves, and other signs that your plant is not getting enough light. The insufficient light exposure reduces chlorophyll synthesis. So sometimes if they spend too much time in the dark, the plant starts losing its green color. If lighting doesn't improve, then the leaves will eventually fall off and become yellow. But another thing that's very interesting, as we see in this picture, is the non-green pigments, also the reds and oranges, also get affected by low light. And there's plants like this croton that when grown in high light, as this plant was in the beginning, they had all these red pigments in their leaves. Then I moved the plant over to a place where it didn't have straight sunlight. And the new leaves are all green, a little bit of yellow on the veins, but they lost all the red. That happens because there's not enough light to produce those red and orange pigments. So prevention of low radiation, if it's indoors, you can use artificial lighting. Of course, you should always choose a plant that's adapted to low light anyway. But even if it's by a window and getting enough light, it's important to rotate the plant from time to time so it doesn't have this like leaning growth, and it adequately grows on all sides. For outdoor plants, super key to select the appropriate location from the beginning, but there's always transplanting if you feel like it's not performing in a spot because it doesn't have enough light. So that's all my factors. Now we're gonna have Debra join in the conversation and talk about nutrients.
Okay, thank you, Virginia. So nutrients for plants are essential for growth, just like they are for people. And with plants, they're generally split into two categories, macronutrients and micronutrients. So that distinction is based on the amount that is necessary for the plant to survive and grow. So it's just the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium, the macronutrients, they are needed in higher quantities in the plant. So we're going to talk about some of these a little bit more in detail, and some of the key factors. Water, as Virginia mentioned, is essential for the uptake of the nutrients from the soil into the plant roots and up through the plant. So drought and flooding can hinder this uptake. The nutrient mobility affects where the symptoms will first appear, and that refers to the plant's ability to take the nutrients from one place and move them to another place. So if the nutrient is mobile, then the plant can move it to a new place and use it where it needs it. The soil temperature and the weather can also affect nutrient uptake. So often when the soil temperature is cold, there's less nutrient uptake, and if weather, sometimes when it's too hot or if there's high humidity, can also affect whether the water is being taken up in the plant, which affects the nutrient uptake. Soil pH is another very important factor to keep in mind. There are, the nutrients may be in the soil, but they may not be available for the plant to use if the pH is not in the proper range. And we'll talk about that in just a second some more. Often soil and water testing are recommended for an accurate diagnosis. And when we talk about this a little more, you'll kind of understand why you may need the testing. This is a very common chart. You can find these online. It's a nutrient availability by pH. And if you look on here, you notice that when you get into more acidic, you start to have some of these nutrients that are less available. And so, and as also happens when you move more alkaline and your pH goes up, you also see some of these that are not very readily available for the plant to use. So like I said, they may be in the soil, but if your pH is not correct, you just may not be able, the plant may not be able to use them. So we often recommend trying to keep your pH between a 6 and 6.5 range, unless you have plants that specifically like acidic soils, then you might move down into the 5 or 5.5 range. This is just a representation. It's kind of a quick key on some of these symptoms for nutrient deficiencies. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail, but I just wanted to show you this one. It's a quick guide to look at if you're at home. There's a lot of different variations on this kind of chart, but you'll see that they are set up usually by where you see the symptoms, the base of the plant, the middle or all of the plant, or at the top on the newest leaves. And that goes back to that mobility of the nutrients. So at the top, the potassium, magnesium, nitrogen, and phosphorus are all mobile, which means the plant is able to take those nutrients from the old leaves and move them up into the new leaves to continue its growth. Whereas these ones down here in the bottom, the zinc, copper, calcium, boron, iron, and magnesium, you will see those symptoms in the new leaves first because they are not mobile. So once the plant finds that it's deficient in the soil, there's just nothing it can do. So the new leaves are where you're going to see that first. And you'll see on here most of these. So if you look at the base of the plant is where you're having issues, and maybe you're seeing necrosis, which just means death on the tissue, which is usually going to be brown, maybe papery or crispy. Or you might have chlorosis, which just means yellowing. And then, so if you have chlorosis, it might be interveinal, which means in between the veins of the leaves, or uniform, which is throughout the whole leaf. And you might see things like early flowering. Leaf abscission just means that the leaves are dropping off the plant early. Some, like for phosphorus, you might see some purple. And so if you go work through these keys, it can kind of help you determine where your issues are. We're going to talk a little bit more about a couple of these. So nitrogen, we're going to start with. It tends to be a very common issue, and it's often talked about as far as being in fertilizer. So it is a major component of chlorophyll and proteins, but it leaches out of the soil very easily during heavy rains and frequent irrigation. So in your spring and summertime is when you often see this. It is mobile, as I said, so you'll see it on the older leaves first. Overall, the leaves are going to be lighter green, smaller. Shoots and branches will be shorter and fewer numbers, and you'll have stunted growth of the plants. And for a remedy, you can apply your high nitrogen fertilizer and mulching with compost to provide a slow, steady supply of nutrients can help. Here's some photos. As you can see, when you're comparing some of these, the plants are much smaller and they're very yellow. This one, you can see the leaves at the outer leaves are going to be a little more green, so that yellowing starts at the base of the plant. Phosphorus is another macronutrient that can sometimes be deficient, and it is needed for your healthy roots and shoot growth. Deficiencies with this also can occur during high rainfall and often in heavy clay soils or in cold soils. It's very often in early spring or sometimes even in the fall. We see it a lot with pansies when we're growing in the fall. So it is also mobile. It will be seen on the older foliage. The leaves may appear bronze or purple color, especially on the lower surface. Overall, the leaves will be smaller. You may see some distortion or crinkling of the leaves. They will often fall off early, and shoots will be smaller in diameter and often weak looking. So again, applying fertilizer such as a superphosphate or bone meal, and adding soil amendments like compost to help improve the soil structure in heavy clays will help. And again, here's some photos. So this is very typical on our pansies. You'll see this purpling, especially in cooler temperatures, and eventually you will start seeing some of the necrosis on the leaves. Potassium is needed for controlling water uptake and photosynthesis. It promotes flowering, fruiting, and general hardiness. It tends to be more common on light sandy soils and in potting mixes that are soilless. It is, once again, mobile, so you'll see it on the older leaves. They will often have marginal or interveinal chlorosis, so that yellowing in between the veins. And it will, as symptoms progress, move into necrosis, so death, especially starting at the edges and moving into the middle. You may also see some crinkling of the leaves and rolling upwards, and the tips will eventually start dying, and there'll be overall poor flowering and fruiting. Again, to remedy this, you can apply a high potassium fertilizer and amend the soil with some compost. So here's some pictures of that. And you'll see the some yellowing of the plant leaves and the necrosis here. And so that's very typical, a little bit of that rolling of the edges. So iron is one of our micronutrients that tends to be an issue. And so it's also important in photosynthesis. While soil shortages tend to be rare, it's usually more a case of a pH issue that is making the iron unavailable. So it is one of our immobile nutrients. So you will see it on the young leaves. It's very, very common to see interveinal chlorosis. Eventually you will get some burning, scorching necrosis on the leaf edges. It's often more severe during the cool, wet spring weather. And you will have the shoot growth can be smaller in diameter, and your terminal buds will start to die back. So you can help this situation by adding chelated iron, and that will be kind of a temporary fix. And your best bet is to check your pH of your soil, and you may need to amend that and lower that pH to help it make it more acidic by adding sulfur or aluminum sulfate. This is very common in like the Midwest. You'll see it in pin oaks, tends to be a very common issue. And so here's a very typical picture. You'll see that yellowing in between the veins on the newer leaves, and this is what the plant should look like. So I'm going to move ahead a little here for the sake of time. We want to be able to answer some of your questions. We're going to talk just briefly about fertilizers. These are some examples of fertilizer labels. And you'll notice on most fertilizer labels, they have 3 big numbers. And those numbers relate to the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they're always in that order. So it's always nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Sometimes it's referred to as NPK, like down here on this vine vitality in the right-hand corner. And so like I said, that's the percent of those nutrients in the product. So this one's 15%, 5%, and 15%. You'll also see, like on this top one on the left, it also has calcium and magnesium is a specialty fertilizer that includes those, so that is listed on the bag. You'll also often see on the labels, such as this one in the top right corner, that it does list the percentages for the micronutrients. And the left one also has micronutrients. While the Vine Vitality does not really have the percentages, it does say with micronutrients, so that helps you kind of know that you are getting some of those in your plants. And micronutrients are fairly rare to be deficient in soil, so if you're planting in your garden, but they do tend to be a little more common in house plants where you're using a soilless mix and they might be in the same soil for quite a long time. We're going to touch briefly on some toxicities. Toxicity can happen when there's too much fertilizer applied or the level of nutrients far exceed the needs of the plant. Sometimes the level of soluble salts will be your issue. Soluble salts are measured by electrical conductivity, which is EC. Often you might have heard of that. And if the soluble salts are too high, you'll end up with root burn on the root tips, and it will interfere with moisture uptake. And if you'll notice the signs of fertilizer toxicity, again, as Virginia mentioned, a lot of times the signs of deficiencies and toxicities look very similar. So you're going to see possibly necrosis on the leaf tips, reduced root growth. They may be slow to mature or stunted growth. Again, that chlorosis and leaves falling off prematurely, reduced yields, and tall plants with weak stems. So sometimes it can be difficult to tell the difference between toxicities and deficiencies. So soluble salts can be an issue whether it might come from excessive fertilizer. So if you're applying more fertilizer than what the plant actually is using. It can also come from high EC in the water, which can be from sodium, calcium, or magnesium. Depending on where you think your issue is coming from, if you think maybe you're just over fertilizing, such as perhaps you fertilize every time you water, then you want to go ahead and switch to clear water for several days, and then going ahead, reduce the frequency. So maybe only fertilize once a week instead of every day if you're watering on a daily basis, or at least just stretch out how often you're fertilizing. If it's possible that maybe you just over fertilized one time, maybe you read the instructions wrong and put way too much water or fertilizer in your water, then you can go ahead and leach the soil with clear water, which just means using that clear water to run water through the soil to help move some of those nutrients out of the root zone. And if you think it's an issue with your water, which can be the case with some well water, and sometimes it can be an issue with city tap water in your house plants especially. So you want to go ahead and leach your soil with a distilled water several times a year to help move some of those excess nutrients out of the soil and salts. Fluoride is another one that is a common toxicity in house plants, so I wanted to touch on it briefly. You might see marginal chlorosis and necrosis, and sometimes spotting. It's very common, like on this one here with the aglaonemas on the left, and these other two are both dracaenas, where you see that tip burning and possibly spotting on the leaf, especially on the margins. And again, you can help remedy this a little bit by adding dolomite or calcium hydroxide to the potting soil, which you want to try to help keep the pH around 6 to 6.5. So if your pH has gotten low, you might have more issues with this. And you can also help by leaching with distilled water 3 or 4 times a year. And especially most of our city tap water has fluoride in it. And so that's where we often see this as an issue. So in summary, diagnosing plant problems is not easy, so don't be hard on yourself if you're having trouble figuring out what's wrong with your plant. The plants have limited ways to express illness, so many of the problems have the same signs and symptoms. It's very important to try and get to know your plants, and so that you understand what's typical for them, and you can start to see when, like, maybe their color is a little wrong, or if they start to look a little droopy, so you know what's typical for your plant, because every plant can be different, even just from my house to my neighbor's house, or from county to county or state to state. There's different issues that all the plants may react slightly different. You may need to be a detective. Ask questions and think about what has changed. Is the light changing, the temperature, location, a water source, or people? That can often be an issue, especially if you're in an office setting. Maybe somebody's adding their morning coffee to your plant, or those kind of things happen all the time. So you have to kind of dig in and ask questions and try and see what's happening. And you can always ask for help. We have wonderful university extension offices around the country. Most states have a Master Gardener program that's involved with their extension office. And don't be afraid to talk to your local garden centers and ask for help. And that ends our talk for today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Deborah. That was terrific. Virginia, you want to come back on and we'll all be able to answer questions and see what people want to know more about. That really was very good. Thank you for helping us out and to learn more about the signals that the plants are trying to tell us that we better do something or they're not going to be as happy as we want them to be. So we've had some questions. So we have, is it better to add fertilizer to houseplants after you water or before you water, or doesn't it make a difference?
It's better if they're moist a little bit, if there's already some water in the medium, because then it doesn't run through. Like if you apply your fertilizer, if the plant is too dry, it tends to first run through until some water percolates the empty spaces in the soil. If it's pre-moist, not necessarily too wet, but if it's pre-moist, then the other water you add with your fertilizer is gonna just remain in the soil. It attaches quicker to the soil particles and it remains there. So it's recommended to pre-water a little bit, not too much though.
Okay, that's good to know. That's what I've been doing, so I'm glad to hear that it's a good thing to do. So this is one that I remember back in college when we learned how to do soil tests. Soil tests are expensive, and to be able to tell what nutrients are available in your soil, you do have to take a number of soil tests. But how many should you take? What do you think? Do you take it every 5 feet or one per garden area? Deborah, you're muted. We can't hear you at all. So you're going to have to unmute.
There we go.
Thank
So
you.
a lot of references will say to take at least 5 samples. It kind of depends on just how big your area is. I mean, if you've got, you know, a small 10 by 10 garden versus a 100 by 100 garden, obviously you may need to take more. The other thing is, if it's an area that you're having problems, maybe you don't need to test your whole garden area. Or if you know that, well, I'm just having area issues in this one corner, maybe I'll just take a couple samples there to try and figure out what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. What I try to do is, because I have gardens around all my whole area, my whole yard. And so some of them are shade gardens and very well drained. Others are sun gardens and very moist because of the spring that's in that area. So I would highly recommend, if the conditions are changing from spot to spot in your areas of your gardens, take a test in that area. And it's important to really dig down and get deep into it, so it's not just the top inch or two. So that's important too. So this is a good one. What causes browning on the leaves of avocado leaves? Every time they try to grow them from the pit, they start out fine, and then they get browning and shrivel up on the leaves.
This is one where we notice that it's a symptom that can mean many different things. So you have to play detective, because what tends to happen is with browning of the leaves is either too wet or too dry, but that's something you can easily test yourself. It's, I mean, how does the soil feel in that small pot where you're growing your seed? But it could ultimately also be nutrition, in which case, I guess it needs to be tested, or you need to know if you're adding too much or too little fertilizer. But sometimes tropical plants require high humidity. Humidity can have an effect on the browning of tips of leaves. Also fluoride in the water. So there's multiple potential outcomes or results from this. Just try to test it. Try to see if you see the soil too wet, too dry. I don't know if Deborah has something to add when it comes to the nutrients.
I was going to agree with you. Probably it's a fluoride if they're using tap water, especially. That's usually can be one of the issues. Of course, over fertilizing could be an issue depending on how much they're doing with that. Especially when they're real little, they don't need a lot.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is, it's good to have this knowledge, but you really have to be a detective, and you have to try different things one at a time, so you know if you're making a difference or not. But what happens if I'm not a good detective? Where can I go? What can I do so that I can maybe narrow it down for what's wrong?
Deborah mentioned you can always search your extension service office or the university garden clubs in your area.
Mhm.
But if you have resources, or maybe take a look at our video once it gets posted, you can start by saying, okay, is it water? No, check it off. Or is it light? Does it have too much, too little light? When there's seedlings, overwatering can be an issue with the avocado. So just kind of like check off a list, and eventually you might get to the point where you need to take a sample somewhere.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to look at extension offices outside your state, especially like if you're looking at a tropical plant, then you might look for Hawaii or Florida. Or,
Good tip.
Because they'll have a little more information than maybe Maryland or Michigan would have. So
Yeah, that's a really good tip. Go to the source that's growing plants similar to you. I like that. So how often should you change the potting mix if you're a container farmer? So you have this mix that you're using in a container to be able to make sure it has the right amount of nutrients. What do you suggest?
that one's kind of tough because it depends on what they're growing. Some things, especially like tomatoes or even like some of your zucchini, cucumbers, those kind of things, if you're trying to grow those, they use a lot of nutrients and they will deplete your soil very quickly. It also depends on if you're using a soilless mix in your pots or if you are using soil and compost in those as well. Because your soilless mix will become depleted much more quickly also. I would advise at least every year adding some more compost to it, so that way you're always supplementing it and trying to keep it a little bit more fresh.
Okay. How about just fertilizing too? Because that potting soil is going to be depleted quickly. So if you fertilize on a regular basis, that's adding the nutrients, and then the potting soil is just a foundation for the plant in the container for the roots. Yeah, I think that would help them out too. So should they move indoor plants outside for the summer? And how do you manage them to bring them back in to avoid shock from losing leaves and all that other good stuff that it does when we bring them in for the winter? Because I know I put mine outside and bring it in. So give me some advice.
I think some of them it's okay to move in and out. Some others, I think they are gonna be in shock because they don't like being moved. Once they're adapted to your indoor spaces, they probably want to remain there. But some plants can go outside. Now, when you take them outside, make sure they acclimate. They go first into a shady spot on your deck or the front of your house. It needs to be gradual, that because they are so adapted at that point to indoor low light. So going outside requires being in the shade. But at the same time, if that's a plant that may not perform, the flowering part may not perform if that is the case. Then when you bring them back in, yes, there's going to be shock and they may lose some of the leaves. But if you want to enjoy them outside and the temperatures are appropriate, above 55 for most indoor plants, then you may not mind managing some of the shock effects that you see in the plants. I don't know, particularly, I don't move my houseplants outside. You said you move some. Which ones? Like, do you have an example of which ones you move?
I have my split leaf philodendron. I have my orchids. I have my clivia. I have a lot of plants that go outside just so I can sweep my floor in the summertime. So yeah, there are a lot of things.
Right. Every time they change location, there will be some shock, but that may not detrimentally affect the plant. Just you can groom it and take off the dead leaves, and once it acclimates back to its original spot, it's going to be fine.
Okay. There are a lot of questions going on about water because you both expressed a concern of fluoride in the water or maybe some other minerals that they don't want to have. Do you suggest using rainwater? Do you suggest using distilled or filtered water? Should you use ice cubes? Please say no, don't use ice cubes.
No ice cube.
No ice cubes. Yeah, cold temperature is not necessarily a good thing for plants, so we wanna avoid that.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the water quality, obviously it would be ideal if you can afford to always use filter water or buy some water that is from springs or something. or collect rain if you have that ability, it is definitely going to be healthier for the plant. But sometimes a lot of plants are not necessarily going to have a terrible effect from fluoride, and you can always trim the leaves off. The ones that are usually older leaves get the effect first. So, I mean, it's okay to use the water you have. Now, some plants, dracaenas, for example, are very, very sensitive to fluorine or fluoride. So it depends on the plant you have or how you mind what it looks like.
Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. Generally, it's not a huge issue. There are just a couple of plants that are extra sensitive to it. So.
Okay, but it never hurts to gather rainwater and use it. I mean, that's great to have a rain barrel and use it on your plants. I think that's super. Well, the questions are really pouring in. I can't read them fast enough. You see my eyeballs looking to the right just so I can get them. But when you're watering your plants, if it's a bright sunny day and water gets on the leaves, do you have to worry about sunburn?
I don't have a complete definite answer about this. I've heard this so often. Oh, there's a magnifying lens effect, and it's gonna the sun rays are gonna penetrate this water droplet and have a magnification effect of the water. I haven't particularly seen that myself. So no, I think it doesn't come from watering in the sun. The sunburn is gonna come just from exposure to sun, whether there's water there or not, based on my experience. But we can double check later on.
That's been my experience too. How about you, Debra?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've heard that it's possible, but I generally don't see it. And, you know, we're in the greenhouse in 100-degree weather, and I haven't noticed that, no.
Good to know. This one, I don't know. And I'm a vegetable gardener big time. What does the presence of liverworts covering the vegetable garden indicate? You don't have to know the answer to this either. We can ask some of our specialists if you don't know this answer.
Covering, like, I'm guessing the soil. Well, liverworts love high humidity and moisture. So I'm assuming just similar to that flower pot parasol fungus, when they're growing there, it means there's plenty of moisture for them to grow. They don't have a detrimental effect on the plant themselves. Now, if it's a plant that doesn't like staying too wet, then that could be a problem. It's telling you, hey, this area is remaining too wet. But that would be my guess based on the biology I know of liverworts and their growing conditions. But I haven't never seen that before either.
Me neither. I've grown vegetables for 35, 40 years, probably longer. Also, is it best, when should you fertilize your plants? Is it best to fertilize them all year long, just in the summer, in the winter? When is it best to fertilize? House plants, I should say.
Depend on the plants so much, right? Okay. Debra, do you have? I would say definitely whenever you purchase or own a plant, you have to know their name, know exactly what they are, what are their requirements, because if you have an orchid at home, they like very diluted fertilizer very often, and maybe not during the winter times or when they have just finished flower, then you want to promote leaf growth. But it depends on the plant. Some others, you may be okay with fertilizing once a year. So it depends.
I would agree with that. I mean, most of the time you want to fertilize if your plants are actively growing. And so that's why you often hear not to fertilize during the winter time, because they're just really not growing much when they are in that lower light situation. And then, you know, once the light levels start picking up again in the spring, you can start your fertilizer again. A very light fertilizer during the winter might still be appropriate if your plants are actively growing because you've got a warmer, you know, sunnier location. But typically, yeah, during the winter, you want to ease off and not encourage a lot of growth.
Now, I realize I introduced you at the very beginning of the presentation, but this is a question that I know your roles are really going to be able to help you answer this question, because I know how hot it is in the greenhouse, and you just said it too. So tell us where you work, Debra and Virginia, and then tell us how hot it is in the greenhouse right now, and what your specialties are, and is it okay to apply liquid fertilizer when it's very hot? So I want to know what you're doing today. Are you applying liquid fertilizer? So Virginia, we'll start with you. Who are you? What's your background? And then Debra will move on over.
Yes, Virginia Thaxton. I have a bachelor's in biology and a master's in horticulture. I work for the interiors department section at Smithsonian Gardens. So I'm part of the team that takes care of all the plants inside the museums. Tropical plants mostly is my expertise. So I don't tend to spend that much time inside the greenhouse, even though we have a greenhouse that tends to the museums and where we keep the plants that go to the interiors. Today it's been hot here, but it just started raining actually outside. So that's gonna cool down the rest of the afternoon. Debra does spend more time in the greenhouse, and when it's in the 80s or 90s outside, it can get above 110 in the greenhouse if we don't keep the temperatures under control, which you can do in the greenhouse. She can explain.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. So I'm Debra Austin. I have a bachelor's in horticulture, and my position here is at the greenhouse. I take care of one greenhouse, but it's in support of the butterfly pavilion that is located downtown in the Natural History Museum. So I grow all the plants for that butterfly pavilion. And yes, it definitely can get very warm in the greenhouses. Our setup, in at least in my house, we just have an open roof system. So it all is just the airflow of the heat rising out of the greenhouses is how mine is cooled. So it's always at least as hot as outside. And as far as fertilizing, I fertilized today when I watered. So I would recommend trying to do that in the mornings when it is a little bit cooler, and try not to fertilize the foliage a whole lot. You know, try to keep your water down on the soil, which is a good practice just to help with disease prevention as well. So.
Mm-hmm. And that will cause spots on leaves. If you get fertilizer on the leaf in full sun, it can cause spots. So we have way more questions. So you're going to be busy writing answers so that we can post them up on our resource page. But I want to thank you both. That was a very interesting subject and something that we all need to know a little bit more of. And I thank you. Again, I'm reminding everybody that's still online, we're going to take a 2-week hiatus between our summer series and our fall series. And I look forward to seeing you all back again on September 24th. Thanks for everything. Bye-bye.